I think the vast majority of Negroes in this country know that they want to be people, they want to be men, they want equality, period. It just boils down to that. And we haven't been able to be people. We haven't been men because of all of the conditions that we've lived with and the syndrome of deprivation surrounding conditions, whether it's in housing, in the economic area, or in schools, or in the vicious credit practices that we face in the ghetto, and all of the problems of closed doors and constant defeats. But in spite of all this, I think we all know, basically, that we want to be men. We want to be persons judged not on the basis of the color of our skin, but on the basis of the content of our character.
What King is doing in that interview is indicative of the mindset shift that was happening at the time. He's tying your manhood to what the government is or isn't willing to give you. What King's rhetoric, what he was doing with his rhetoric, with the civil rights movement and all that, was instilling a sense of bitterness and a woe is me kind of mentality into black folks, into black culture. And so in so doing, he's moving black Americans from a trying race under the leadership of people like Booker T. Washington to a crying race under the leadership of King, Abernathy, and his whole Marxian contingent. So yes, absolutely.
You've never proved he was a Marxist this entire conversation.
When you look once again at the Cato Institute study conducted in 2019, where more blacks have a favorable view of socialism than the free market system, that is the legacy of the civil rights agenda, which is now the civil rights industry. That's what that's a legacy of. So we can bitch and moan all we want about the legacy of slavery. Oh, we deserve reparations, all this nonsense. To the extent that you do that, you sound pathetic.
The unfortunate
you sound
reason,
like a pathetic loser.
The
reality is, I don't have, like,
reason.
I used to be homeless. I used to live out of my car. I know what it's like to be down on your luck and having not 2 pennies to rub together. I know what that's like. And it's through conventional means that I was able to make something of myself, where I now run a plumbing company, where I now run a film company. I didn't do it by going through some government program. I didn't do it by leaning into this. No, I did it by being a man. That's what's required of us. In keeping with Booker T. Washington, in keeping with Joseph H. Jackson, I could be a protester today because I felt sorry for myself and the government owes me something. No, the conditions that led to my homelessness was done by yours truly. And yes, I may have been dealt a bad hand in this area or that area of my life, but at the end of the day, it's up to the victim to get himself up, to take advantage of his opportunities, whatever opportunities those are. And yes, those opportunities existed even during Jim Crow. All we're doing, Austin, is we're feeding into this kind of woe is me mentality that doesn't breed genuine liberty, that doesn't breed genuine equality. I want to see that turn around. I want to see that begin to shift by people taking personal responsibility.
So for you, what was the actual legacy of the civil rights movement? What was the actual impact? Most people see it as there's no middle ground here. It was definitely good. The legislation was good. The impact for our society has been overall good. What is your view on that? Do you disagree with that statement? And was it good or bad, ultimately?
I strongly disagree with it.
Why? Because
it goes against practical wisdom.
How?
The civil rights movement. We explain how in 19 episodes of the MLK Project.
If you could give me your top 3 reasons.
No, so here's the problem, and I'm trying not to be difficult here, Amelia. I really am. And I keep telling myself, okay, the next question she asks, let me try to answer it in under a minute. But then I go on for 10 minutes. So it's your fault. But the thing is, here's why your question is so difficult to answer. It's so difficult to answer because we have so many preconceived notions about what America is and what America is supposed to be that informs how we deal with how that question is answered. Does that make sense?
Yes. Yes.
So the civil rights movement being a good thing makes sense to us because we're conditioned from the time we can walk to believe that it's a good thing. What did the civil rights movement yield? Well, it yielded to some degree universal suffrage. It yielded to some degree this notion that if you are a private business owner, you don't really have the freedom of association, because your freedom of association could be detrimental to your black neighbor, right? So you should be forced to serve people against your will. For me, a better society than what we live in now requires a greater deal of maturity that I'm concerned we don't have as a society. And that's on purpose. That's quite deliberate. I mean, when you look at things like that they're pushing in schools now, like, people think of DEI and all that. I mean, that's only part of the issue, CRT. They're also pushing things like trauma-informed learning and I forget what the other one is called.
Social emotional learning?
Social emotional learning, which I understand like the concept of what they're doing, but from those who are the most vocal activists for the utilization of social emotional learning, trauma-informed learning in schools, it can never be a thing where they're dealing with the potentiality of a student who might have like family issues or background issues that affect his ability to learn the material in school. It can never be just that. If it was just that, I'm fine with it. But there's always these agendas attached to it, right? Mm-hmm. I heard one activist say that they want to be able to use social emotional learning so that when those students come of age, they will be more sympathetic to social justice causes in the world. So why is there these added on agendas to what it is these people are trying to do? You know what I mean? So they take something that is a legitimate issue, what can be considered a legitimate grievances, because yes, there are a lot of students who have certain traumas who come from certain neighborhoods. Yes, there are these issues, but why are you trying to undergird it with all of this pork that serves your long-term political agenda? Like, why? When you look at the fact that through our education system, we are taught that universal suffrage is a good thing. We are taught that in a way, because they don't say this directly, but when you're taught in a way that, freedom of association in its rawest form is a bad thing, it then begins to make sense that, oh yeah, the civil rights movement was a good thing. Because in a mature society, that's where I was going with the whole CRT and emotional learning and all these things. In a mature society where you begin to understand not everybody's going to like me, for whatever reason, not just skin color, but for a myriad reasons that may be known or unknown to me. Not everybody's going to like me. To the extent that I'm aware of that, I understand that this person might not serve me because X, Y, and Z. That person might not serve me because of X, Y, and Z. That person might serve me because of X, Y, and Z. I would be better off living in that society, because to the extent that I do, I know that the quality of the goods and services I get will be a higher quality. What do I mean by that? Well, if I'm going to a barbecue restaurant that's owned by a white man who just doesn't like me because I happen to be from Texas or because I'm black or whatever the case may be, and he's the one back there making my food, and he's compelled to make me a plate, because if he doesn't, I can sue him for racism and da-da-da-da-da-da. He's not going to do as good of a job, put his best foot forward in making my food. Whereas if he wants to serve me and has no problems with me or whatever the case may be, he's going and he wants for his product or for his restaurant to be visited by more and more people who I would then go and tell, like, hey, you should check out that restaurant. They're really good. If he has that kind of interest, then he's going to put his best foot forward in terms of the quality of the food that he makes. When people are compelled to do a thing against their wishes, it has a kind of a resentment that follows. So what I'm saying to a lot of people, they might hear me and say, well, I hear what you're saying, but at the end of the day, it's not right to not serve somebody because they're black. Never mind the fact that person took out a loan, started their business, put in their own blood, sweat, and tears, or whatever the case may be, to build their business up. But yeah, none of that matters because it sucks for that black person to not be served because this white person doesn't like them. And of course, I keep using race as an example, but again, I go back to the fact that somebody might not like you for a whole lot of other issues. And the reality of it is, when you look at the Jim Crow laws and you look at the fact that Negroes could only go through certain doors and stuff like that, in many instances, those weren't even being enforced. Yeah, they were enforced in some instances, but not every instance. It's just like in 2020 when you had the mask mandates. Like, I live in Dallas. Judge Clay Jenkins, who was our county judge at the time, issued a decree, quite frankly, where business owners were fined if they allowed patrons to come through their door without a mask on. There were businesses that were defying that weren't enforcing that. They were allowing people to come into, in some instances, they hoped that Clay Jenkins would come after them so they can take the case to the Supreme Court. That same thing was happening in the 1940s and 50s and 60s because a lot of these Jim Crow laws were holdovers from a bygone era. They weren't really being enforced. In fact, when you look at the Montgomery bus boycott, many of the bus drivers in Montgomery were not even enforcing those holdover laws on their buses. They were allowing Negroes to sit anywhere they want, right? The reason why they chose that specific bus for Rosa Parks is because they knew that bus driver was one of the few who actually enforced the law. So these laws were actually dying of natural causes, and it was in fact the exacerbation of the issue and the pinpointing the issue and making it a national sensationalized thing that the state of Alabama felt like, okay, we're being pressured. Let us now double down and enforce every bus driver to enforce the segregation law, because that's our way of showing them. And this is what Marxist agitation does. To the extent that things are beginning to wane, subside, they like to reopen wounds and put some more salt and vinegar in it, because to the extent that there's turmoil and crisis, that creates enough fodder to push a political agenda. And because you have reactionary forces. Saul Alinsky said in Rules for Radicals that the reaction is more important than the action. You do the agitation and the propaganda, and we're looking for some patriot, and I use the word patriot loosely here, in this context, some self-proclaimed patriot who will take matters into his own hand, do something foolish as a reactionary. Here comes the cameras and the press to shine a camera in that guy's face and say, look, this is a poster child for everything that's wrong with America. And the effect that has on the masses is, well, we don't want to be like that guy. That guy's a racist. So let us now acquiesce and comply and give them everything that they want, and get these guys who agree with the social justice cause into office to radically rejigger America, because we don't want to be like that guy in the newspaper. And so this is the way that this kind of agitation and propaganda works. Well, wasn't the civil rights movement a good thing? Well, again, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, universal suffrage. I don't agree with universal suffrage. I know that's not going to win me any brownie points with a lot of people, because a lot of people believe that everybody and their dog should be able to vote. I don't believe that. I believe that people who are voting should have a vested interest in the country or the community where they're voting, right? I live in a town where I own a house. I don't believe that if you don't pay property taxes because you're renting, that you should have a say in how much money whether there's an increase or a decrease in my property taxes. Things as simple as that. I believe that, for example, people who don't understand how the government works, checks and balances, the role of the press, and so on and so forth, I don't believe that such people should have a say in who represents us. I just don't. Again, I know that's not going to win me a lot of brownie points, but the fact is, if you don't understand how something works, but you're voting to put somebody in charge of it, that creates a problem, because specifically on the campaign trail, because a politician who doesn't know the Constitution, who doesn't understand the Constitution, who's being paid by some lobbyist or special interest, but they are saying that, oh, yeah, if you vote for me, I'm going to do X, Y, and Z. Never mind the fact that X, Y, and Z isn't even within their constitutional jurisdiction, but they're promising it to you. And because you're foolish, and I say that not to be derogatory, because, let me use a better word, because you're ignorant to what the Constitution says, you don't know the difference. Like, you don't know that, okay, this guy is making all these promises. It's not even within his constitutional jurisdiction. He can't possibly represent me. But because there's this mass ignorance, but yet there's this universal suffrage, we believe that everybody in their, right now, you're trying to lower, depending on who the activist is that you're talking about, trying to lower the voting age to 16 in some cases. I've heard as young as 12. Whether you're talking about Bernie Sanders, who wants to extend the right to people who are incarcerated, on and on I can go. Wanting to extend the right to people who came over the border 5 seconds ago and who aren't even American citizens. So they're trying to expand it even more. When you look at universal suffrage, this is something that Karl Marx himself advocated for, because it was part of a overall agenda for the rise of the proletariat against the bourgeoisie. So I look at it in those terms, and Martin Luther King was doing it in those terms. And so the Voting Rights Act of 1965, all it served to do was to more closely expand the federal government insofar that you're now nationalizing the electoral process. Because it used to be the case that the electoral process was controlled locally and by states, but they want to centralize it and expand it to a kind of federally controlled thing, because it's all about centralization in the Marxist worldview. Of course, it's not totally federalized right now, but they're ever trying to federalize the electoral process. This is why they're constantly having a re-up. They now have something, I don't know if they still have it on the docket, but the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, right? The Voting Rights Act of 1965 wasn't enough. It was an incremental step in that direction. But the idea is to ever so often reintroduce new voter rights legislation that will move us closer and closer to the final day of totally federalizing the electoral process, which moves us once again to this kind of rising of the proletariat. But again, I think that at this point is a kind of pie in the sky thing, because you're now asking people to be mature enough to live in such a society, and I don't know that we are.
Mm-hmm. And there's been a lot of benefit to keeping all of this apparatus alive. You know, there's lawsuits that you can enter into, there are victim narratives that you can spin, and benefit from all of that in this society. So it's hard to release that, and it's also mostly, I think, that maturity level of recognizing and making peace with the fact that you cannot control who people are, what they believe. And I have come to terms with the fact that that is a lot of what the civil rights acts and bills and things like that try to do. It tries to control someone's hate, or it tries to control someone's religious beliefs, or it tries to correct the way that you think someone is wrong about something. And it's just not practical. But that is at the core of social justice work itself. So, and I think that that's a part of why activists and liberals in general have a hard time seeing why what they're doing is wrong, because, you know, if we feel that the approach of the civil rights movement, which is to, you know, reach the hand of the state inside of, you know, the life of the individual and the private sphere, and force them to do as you will, and go against what they want, then what's so wrong about doing that through, you know, diversity, equity, and inclusion, or through these other means?
I'm Nikki Giovanni. I'm just a poet. I only have words. So the words I wanted to share were thug life. Tupac was a big fan of voting. I, too, am a thug. And this poem is entitled Vote. It's not a hug, nor mistletoe at Christmas. It's not a colored egg at Easter, nor a bunny hopping across the meadow. It's a vote saying you are a citizen. But, and this is an important but, I am a citizen. I should be able to vote from prison. I should be able to vote from the battlefield. I should be able to vote when I get a driver's license. I must be able to vote if I'm in the hospital, if I'm in the old folks' home, if I'm needing a ride to the polling place. I am a citizen. I must be able to vote.
You know who Nikki Giovanni is. We actually covered this in the MLK Project. She said that when you look at the generations of Black folks who were responsible for the Black Wall Streets in Oklahoma and North Carolina and all these different places, she said that's what we did historically. She says, my generation, the baby boomers, we were not good business people, we were good civil rights people, is what Nikki Giovanni says. And then she would later say in that same interview, it's time for middle class Negroes to stop being afraid of being Black, whatever the hell that's supposed to mean. I can tell you exactly what it means. She said that middle-class Black folks are too compliant and too content with white middle-class values. They're afraid to be Black because if they weren't afraid to be Black, they will be more involved in social justice. They will be more involved in protesting. And this is at a time where they are having the vote or die kind of, campaign and all that whenever she did this interview. And she lauded Puff Daddy for, here's a man who is able to merge both. Yes, he's in business. Yes, he's doing, all the things, the producing and all that, but he's also doing the activist work. He's not afraid to be Black, right? And so you see this kind of moving of the goalpost that takes place. And this is how like this kind of dialectic materialism works. It's constantly moving. Once you figured out how they did this thing, they're already on to the next thing, And so when you look at what it did to Black America, again, how do you go from 4 to 5 Black children being born and raised in a 2-parent household to now 70+% of Black children being born and raised in single mother households? How do you go from the entrepreneurial spirit? How do you go from the literacy rates trending in one direction and then going into a different direction? And I think it's been at a plateau since like the 1970s as far as home ownership and things of this nature. But the reality is, like, we were moving and trending in one direction, the rhetoric came along, or it was popularized because it's always been there. Rhetoric is popularized and then you see it shifting into another direction. I think Nikki Giovanni speaks more profoundly to this issue than a lot of us care to realize. We were not a business people, we were a civil rights people. That marked the kind of transition that would take place in Black America. And so that's not to say that all of Black America's in the tubes, because yes, we still have our doctors and our lawyers and our professionals and so on and so forth. And that's not even to say that your ability to be civilized is predicated on the kind of job you have, more so than who you are as a person. Because you have a lot of professionals who closely identify with the grievance component of Black culture, more so than a lot of people who don't have the status and stuff that they have. So it's just this mixed bag, quite frankly. But again, I would argue that, to your question of like, wasn't the civil rights movement a good thing? Look at Black America and you tell me, compared to before the civil rights movement. I would say that it wasn't.
No comment from me on that. So you would say that it wasn't. I'm sorry to cut you off.
Yes, Amelia. That's the shortest answer you're going to get from me today. Yes, I do. I would say that it was a bad thing.
Okay.
So,
Okay.
Yeah.
And so, in your view, if Blackness is not defined by race in that situation, because she was saying that people who are racially Black are not, they're actually afraid to be Black. They're not really Black. Then how do you think she was defining Blackness?
She meant the same thing. She's now dead and gone. Her earthly body is expired. But the thing is, like, when what she is arguing is the same thing that one of her many successors is arguing right now. Nikole Hannah-Jones said just a few years ago that there's a difference between being ethnically Black and being politically Black. She said that in a tweet. She's since deleted that tweet, although it's still floating around on the internet because there's such a thing as screenshots. But yes, it's something that a lot of people realize, at least subconsciously. But she was one of the few people who was actually able to articulate it on Twitter via text, but also, I guess, vocally, that there is a difference between being politically Black and ethnically Black. The fact is, the label of being Black was a political agenda from its very inception. It was never a point. It was never a thing where this kind of mass movement for colored people to call themselves black was a thing that was honest, a thing that was harmless, a thing that was non-political. It's always been political. I mean, say it loud, I'm black and I'm proud. It was part of an agenda. In fact, when you look in at the late 60s, early 70s of the Black Power movement, these were youngsters who were insisting on not being called Negro anymore because there's a new Negro. We are black. And they were tying black to this kind of militant Marxian social justice activism. That's what they were tying blackness to. And so that's why I argue from its inception that it's always been a political move. Of course, by the time you get to the 80s, Jesse Jackson, who prior to was singing to the same tune of Black Power, especially after the assassination of King, by the time you get to the 80s and he cleans himself up and he sophisticates himself, he is advocating for, let's move from now black to African American, right? But that's also a political move as well. And he would justify by saying, look, Irish call themselves Irish American, Italians call themselves Italian Americans. They have pride in their distant heritage. Why can't black people also have pride in their distant heritage, which is Africa? So he pushes for African American. This at the same time that he's marching, saying, hey, hey, ho, ho, Western Civ has got to go, right? So this idea of Western civilization being sinful, being imperialists and oppressors and colonizers. They were upset because there wasn't enough black history being taught at the colleges and universities, and they were trying to bring in some of those Afrocentric studies. And so when you look at that, and then you look at Stokely Carmichael, who in the late 80s, early 90s, was arguing that we had an agenda to put the word African on the lips of every black man in America so that they might associate themselves with Africa and not with America. And the reasoning he gives for that is very interesting. He says that if you identify yourself with Africa as opposed to America, then you will be less likely to defend American capitalism. This is what Stokely Carmichael says. Of course, by this time, his name is Kwame Ture, and he's wearing dashikis and whatever those kufi, or whatever those things are called. Like, he's all in on it, this whole Pan-African thing. Even though he had his issues with Jesse Jackson, he was in agreement with Jesse Jackson in terms of moving Americans, or black Americans in particular, colored Americans, into identifying themselves with Africa.
The search for identity was a positive force. The negative aspect of it was that along with it came a hatred of whites, a conflict between black and white. That conflict began to develop in the civil rights movement and split the civil rights movement down the middle, tore it apart. It was in 1966, however, that the crisis came to a head. At one of those rallies, Stokely Carmichael made a speech. What Stokely said, and I'm paraphrasing it, was the following. When anybody asks you what you want, it's not freedom now. Freedom now had been the slogan of the movement. What does freedom mean? What is freedom now? The thing that makes this country go round, the thing that makes this country move is power. So what you want is power. Black power. What do you want? And black power. And then he asked the crowd, what do you want? And they answered him, black power, black power, black power, black power, with the clenched fists raised. A new slogan was born, and the civil rights movement then took a turn. It tended to become all black. And he dropped integration, he dropped nonviolence, and he began to preach violence. He began to preach separatism. He began to preach black exclusiveness, black identity, and black pride. At that point, the black youth around the country took up the cry, black power, black power. They began identifying more with Africa. And the outward symbols of that identification were the wearing of dashikis, but they became kind of a uniform of the movement.
What effect or impact did the civil rights movement have on the so-called black community? That's a question I don't think enough people pay attention to. What did it have on the dominant society, white America? Mm-hmm. You know, I did that hard WH for
yes,
you, by the way. But what impact did it? What impact did it have? I always say that, you know, the civil rights movement, the rhetoric, took colored people from a trying race to a crying race. King, along with Whitney Young and James Farmer and Roy Wilkins and the whole nine, right? If you look at their interviews, if you look at their rhetoric in that time period, they kind of mastered the art of grievance, mastered the art of complaining. And not only that, they spoke bitterly about the plight of the Negro in America, the conditions of the Negro in America. And there's such a strong juxtaposition between the rhetoric they were using and the actual man on the street interviews that they were actually having with these alleged black men who were supposed to be so affected psychologically by, you know, not feeling like they're equal to and all the things. Like, I found a plethora of black men in Harlem saying, you know, I go to work, I go to the pool hall, I go home and, you know, kiss my wife, and I have no issues at all with being separated from white folks, or I'm not trying to get into their businesses. And then on the flip side of that, you know, I ate a sandwich at a white deli last week. I didn't have a problem finding a seat, you know what I mean? So there was this kind of disconnect between the rhetoric and the notions that were being broadcast and put on page one by the press versus what was actually going on in a lot of people's daily life. That's not to romanticize the past. That's not to make it look like everything was hunky-dory and there were no problems or no issues. That's just to say that there was a transition of a mindset that was taking place in the 60s.
We want agreement by which we can live or die. You choose. I have spoken to you a lot of times in hatred and anger, and you have not heard me. Well, you had better hear me today. It's because you consider me a vagabond leader that I'm not to speak here. Well, you had better cut those neckties off of them black boys that you put in their district, because they don't know what's happening. And I'm from the pits of nigger hell, and I know what's happening.
Why do the people scoff like that? Seems we don't want the truth anymore. Even though we see the grave, we throw aside and foolishly buy into lies. Why don't the leaders fear the Lord? Seems they are not ashamed what they do. They willingly mislead and sow discord. And you actually believe that they're for you. Republicans and Democrats won't save you. Gotta understand that they're depraved to carry out a plan that will enslave you and set you against the one who made you. Influencers and celebrities don't really know much, and they actually won't stand for God if revenue just ceases. I'm just here to help connect the pieces.